2 o'clock a.m. Trent Reznor is the worst, most predictable, most uninspired lyricist working today. The freshman gloom spouted throughout The Fragile are only making it easier for the goth lyric generators on the web. Copy the word decay from this sentence, paste it into a Word document, highlight it, press Shift F7. Every synonym that appears on your thesaurus screen pops up in Trent Reznor's pitiful poetry. Coming from the mouth of a steadily plumping 30-something recluse who, incidentally, is bearing striking resemblances to Phil Hartman's SNL Frankenstein character these days. It's just sad. Does he collect candelabras and Spawn comics? I guarantee it. In the 5 years it's taken to complete The Fragile, Trent seemingly watched Dark City at least 40 times. It's insulting to hear Trent and his PR firm talk up the radical departure and pop flourishes on this record, because the record sounds 100% similar to Broken and The Downward Spiral. Or more accurately, it's like combining the two together. Clever. Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Nine Inch Nails Retrospective, where we are talking about each and every entry in the legendary industrial music band's discography. And today we have with us another guest on this retrospective. We have longtime friend of the show and first-time guest, Trevor. How you doing, Trevor?
I'm doing A-okay.
Hell
Uh,
yeah.
um, uh, it's been a fun week. Been been watching a whole bunch of movies. About to watch the Palme d'Or winner. It was just an accident here pretty soon this week, so
I
I am
have heard
prepping for that.
exclusively wonderful things about that movie. In fact, yeah, Luke, I was going to say, didn't you see that recently?
Yes. The screening broke down halfway, but then it came back. But excellent movie regardless of that.
Yeah.
Hell
Um,
yeah.
I am going to be watching a select few of the director's movies tonight, and then watching It Was Just an Accident probably tomorrow night. Um, I have a screener for it, but watch out for my review for that on cinefied.com, I guess. But
When that is up, I can put that into the description of this video and link it.
sweet,
So
sweet.
do that. Today, as mentioned, very big episode just because Luke and I have kind of teased in previous episodes that this is our favorite Nine Inch Nails album. I'm not sure if it's yours specifically, Trevor, but I know it is up there for you, which is
Oh yeah.
hence why we recruited you to talk about this. So I have my incredibly bulky, I need 2 sleeves of plastic physical evidence that I love this album here. But how I was reading this opening segment here, you may or may not know that there is a notorious pitchfork review of The Fragile that I was reading you an excerpt from, which kind of presaged a bit of a sea change in, I guess, how Nine Inch Nails is seen, culturally speaking. 5 years happened in between the downward spiral and the fragile, which, I mean, that's a pretty long time. A lot of stuff was going on in between these moments. Like Trent was producing a lot more for other people. I've mentioned in episodes past he was working a lot with Marilyn Manson as a kind of mentor and mentee relationship. And by the time The Fragile came out, they had actually had a bit of a falling out, which we kind of have some deep lore as to
Hmm.
one of the songs on The Fragile potentially being about Marilyn Manson. At this point, Trent has become a much bigger name in the realm of alternative music. Also, that heroin problem we were talking about from episodes past is really kind of worse than ever. I think it's kind of indisputable that this is one of the classic rock examples of an album that was made purely because of the excess of drug usage. Like The Fragile is an album that sounds like the drugs that made it. And it makes for a great listening experience, probably didn't make for great recording in the moment. So there were relationships in Trent's life that were being fractured at this point. Drug use was at an all-time worst. And unfortunately, this was a real dark moment for Trent as a musician, being met with this unbelievable acclaim for essentially self-documenting via music one of the worst experiences of your life. That's gotta fuck with your head a little bit. I imagine it's just like, yes, here's an autobiographical statement on why I think I'm terrible and I'm struggling and I'm also kind of dying. And then the entire world goes, yeah, absolutely, man. This is fantastic. I love this. I just can't imagine that would do good things to somebody's psyche. There was kind of a media buzz around The Fragile just because it had taken so long to actually make the record, and the last album was such an unbelievable success. Like, it just kind of got delayed a couple of times over and over again. Some reviews were positive of The Fragile. It was not exactly like a huge downturn, but this is kind of when some critics do kind of break away from this moment in music and alternative music because there is kind of a growing image of Trent as this kind of, goth outsider that's a little bit too cool for the establishment, that not everybody is fucking with in the same way that they were at the beginning of the decade. It's kind of like they're sort of wise to his shenanigans, and The Fragile being very much of a piece with the previous album's sounds in a lot of respect could feed into the idea that they could perceive Trent and Nine Inch Nails as a project that was just like, oh, doesn't have any new ideas now. He's just totally gone off the deep end. So there was kind of a bit of a split, even though time has been very kind to The Fragile, as now it's pretty much uniformly seen as like the second greatest statement from the band. But as far as the two of you, do you have any like stories as to how this album came to be one of your favorite entries in this discography? Just because this was one that honestly I don't have much of a story for in general. It was just kind of one of those albums that took me a while to get on the full wavelength of, just because of how massive it is. But once I started kind of entertaining the whole experience more and more, it just kind of slowly climbed its way up as being my favorite. But I don't have like an instance or a prompt exactly.
Good question. For my end, it was kind of a case of, I think it was like one specific song that, we'll talk about when we get to it, that like I latched onto and found and was just really enamored with. And it was at a time when I wasn't really like actively like listening to albums as full things. Like I'd kind of more pick bits and pieces from different albums and just listen to those things. So I would say like the actual process of listening to this album was more like a slow growth of, oh, that song's really good. Wait, the one above and the one below it are also pretty good. Hey, actually, those then it just like goes more and more from
Having
there.
The Fragile be the album that indoctrinates you to the album experience is a hell of a way to break that particular mold. That's kind of amazing, honestly.
And I don't know, I feel like it's also just a weirdly fitting thing to be like my way of listening to a Nine Inch Nails album is not so much a I'm gonna start from the beginning, but I'm gonna select a middle and then do the process of what I would call cancerous lump listening, where it's like you just slowly grow and grow with like the tracks, and you're like, wait, this whole thing's really good actually. But you just start off with that one song's pretty cool.
My experience was really to this exposure from the album. I knew of Trent Reznor, Atticus Ross. Well, Trent Reznor first few from his musical scores, really. That was my first exposure to Trent Reznor and his music. And then my dad really turned me on to not the whole Nine Inch Nails discography right around the time where Gone Girl came out. I was about a junior in high school. And I really loved that score. My dad really urged me to really dive into Nine Inch Nails. And first I heard Downward Spiral, which is really seminal album. But this one I felt like was kind of a different beast. the double album. It's a lot more challenging, in my opinion, than Downward Spiral really provides. I think it's a lot jazzier too. I think one of my perhaps like my one of my favorite songs on this is probably La Mer,
Great choice.
which is just like this jazzy piano industrial just kind of beat that is just a jam. And I have a peculiar relationship with this album because as much as I love it, there are some parts about it that I love more than others, despite this being perhaps my favorite Nine Inch Nails album over Downward Spiral, to where I think the front half of this thing is like a masterpiece. And the second disc kind of feels like what Amnesiac is to Kid A.
Oh wow, I actually love that comparison.
And
That is certainly speaks to the fact that there is a bit of a divide over the two halves of this album, historically speaking. But I think that it's interesting that you you see it as this kind of more challenging piece within itself. And Luke, you actually kind of went about listening to this in a strange way. And I think it's because overall, what I personally think makes it the number one Nine Inch Nails album for me is that it's kind of the best testament to what this group is in one package. It feels less like an album of songs and more like an experience that you are kind of meant to just absorb. It has a lot of moments that do work as singular individual songs, as I think we'll point out, but it's really meant to be absorbed as one big holistic thing. And it like has these things about it that, because of the drugs, because of the excess, it kind of feels like Trent was looking to make the widest possible statement that he could. And really, the indulgent aspects of the Fragile are what make it what it is. And, going into full-on ambient music, like this is the first time this idea is fully committed to by this band. And it's basically like the biggest aspect of Trent's, artistic oeuvre from here on out. We're almost at the turn of the millennium, so the David Fincher soundtracks are basically right around the corner for him. So the idea of Nine Inch Nails becoming a more holistic band is really like this promise is being delivered in spades by just having this messy ass experience that kind of covers every conceivable base that something like this could. Though it does contain some traditionally kind of satisfying moments, notably in I think what is probably what I would consider my favorite song on here nowadays, which is the opener of Somewhat Damaged, which is on the one hand like a really, fun and just like raucous Nine Inch Nails kind of single moment, but it is also overwhelmingly loaded with this like these textural details that feel even kind of atypical of what Trent has been doing up until this point. Like I think of things like the sounds of maybe like a knife being sharpened that's inserted into the instrumental here, that kind of cling, 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 cling. That's just like it's such a strange sound. It almost like feels weird to listen to the moment that you hit it, but basically this song it doesn't really have a start stop structure. It's just different parts of like set of structures that keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until this becomes a fucking cacophony of layering and noise. And it's just this like Trent's just absolutely losing his mind. His voice is super compressed and behind everything. And it's just this idea of being like he's really spiteful on this. Like immediately the attitude is fuck everything, like right out of the gate. There's no luring you into it. Like there's kind of less elegance with than there was on the Downward Spiral, where it kind of felt a little bit more purposeful in how the album led you about. Whereas this just kind of tosses you in to the ocean without a life vest and is like, swim, bitch, immediately off the bat, especially with the first track transitioning into the second at the start with that like wide atmospheric, like that's always been one of my favorite moments of sequencing in their discography, is how the end of the song just sort of builds and you kind of get that, like you hear a little bit of that synth passage in the background of the and then it kind of blossoms out from there and becomes really beautiful in a weird moment. Like that to me is like that's what the Fragile's all about, is just going from this really tightly sequenced big kind of inelegant fuck off industrial thing and then transitioning into this really gorgeous, really spacious moment.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, I kind of see this album as the transition points between the kind of two sort of main identities that they have as like an artistic group, which is, as you're saying, kind of their early stuff with like the very just hardcore, intensive, kind of abrasive sound quality to the ambient style that becomes like their go-to for like film scores, but also just and a lot of their just standard kind of like album work is very baked into that. And I think it's kind of interesting. Just the transition point of the identities is kind of from a moment of basically pure crisis, more or less, which
Oh
I
yeah.
guess that's kind of how it sort of is in real life, is like moments of crisis kind of becomes the transition point for the change of you, which is kind of visualized in a lot of, I think, what the fragile is about. I guess even just the idea of what it's called, the fragile, is that stasis of being stable or complete destruction, kind of those two things. And an interesting thing, even in like the smallest little bits of just sound choices that's present.
The Fragile is a document of how elegantly you fail. Basically, it's an experience that is curated, it's very tightly put together, it's ambitious, it's strange, but there is like a sense and a rhythm to it all its own. It's just way more frenzied. Like you could see Trent on the downward spiral exercising, like even though he was still in the midst of a crisis, he still exercised a kind of self-discipline with how he structured that album. And that is here as well. Like there is a lot to, I think you can sort of speak to the dichotomy that Luke was getting at with the fact that the first half of this feels kind of like a traditional Nine Inch Nails album, and then the second half of the record kind of spirals outward and becomes something way more esoteric than people were probably used to. And I think that contradiction of halves in and of itself is also just like what the fragile is. It's something that doesn't make complete logical sense, but makes complete emotional sense. And it's kind of also why the lyrical sensibilities, like kind of, we kind of spoke to the fact that on the downward spiral, there was kind of a steady balance between like the edgy provocateur sort of thing that Nine Inch Nails was sort of blown up and known for in the media at the time, and also just genuinely very poetic, very thoughtful lyrics. Whereas here, I don't want to say that that is gone necessarily because it isn't, because there are moments where it does kind of feel like The Day the World Went Away, for instance, I think is a beautifully written song. But for the most part, Trent's concerns and how he voices them on this album are way more lizard brained. They're way more just like, give me this, I want this, very like texture, very just like immediate demands. There's something animal, there's something primal about the emotions that are on this album. And then when they're not incredibly direct, they're hugely poetic. So I think that it all kind of speaks to how nothing on this album is done in moderation. It's complete extremes. It's one end of the polarity or the other. Structurally, sonically, lyrically, everything is kind of fighting itself. And I think it's just the friction of it all that really, really works for me.
Yeah, and as you were saying, kind of like the transition from Somewhat Damaged to the second track of the day the day the world went away, you're kind of going like between another one of those two extremes. Like you're getting an extremely like angry Trent Reznor that's like feeling betrayed, like going like, "Where the fuck have you gone? You've left me, you've betrayed me," and then you're getting like this very mournful, very and kind of sweet, kind of like soliloquy that I think kind of the day the whole world went away kind
Yeah.
of gives off because I don't know if this is like true or not, but he feels like he's he's talking about somebody like Kurt Cobain or something like that. I don't know if he's talking about like if that's what he's talking about in the whole day world away, but but this feels like such a hurt song in such a different way than the previous one. So it's maybe one of the most emotionally mature tracks on the record. The kind of way it just kind of like does that explosion of sound towards the end of it, I think is
I
one of my favorite
I think
parts
it's
about it.
very telling that you mentioned Cobain because he was very much within concert with those same sort of anti-establishment rock superstars at the time. I'm sure that, like his death affected basically everybody in any scene, but it does feel like people like Cobain, their deaths colored the second half of this decade in something that feels kind of otherworldly, I guess, in like retrospect. You like look back on it and see that everything that was topical about that moment, where it would address the kind of dangers of fame or stardom, which those ideas are certainly on here. It does so with a kind of just it feels cursed. There's something very kind of raw about everything on the Fragile that feels, like this an album that would like make you recoil if you were able to touch its music, if I could put it in like a synesthetic term. Another kind of moment sort of on the early kind of first part of the album that I do feel like is kind of what you would expect from a Nine Inch Nails album, but kind of the effect of it is on steroids, is something like The Wretched, where it capitalizes on that like nasty, distorted, torn paper guitar sound, Trent's, big blown out vocals, but it also kind of we finally see the final form of, we sort of mentioned how the last two albums have flirted with the idea of the rhythm that you would find in a genre like hip hop, for instance. And that's going to come to a head in multiple ways on here, but on The Wretched, that steady guiding drum beat, I mean, that's so hip hop to me. I mean, you could basically sample this in like a Dalek or a clipping song and it wouldn't be out of place at all. But like
It's
even the kind of delivery that he's got going on where he's like, the wretched, the wretched. It's got he like there's a steadier drive to his delivery.
yeah.
So, you can feel that every disparate sound that they've been pulling from is finally starting to manifest in ways that there's not much subtlety to how things are being blended on here. It's just like, oh, wow, this is a very loud, big idea.
I'd say even the bass on that song is very hip hop too, because you're get like bum 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 bum
Mm-hmm.
bum 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 bum, and it's like all right,
Yeah,
pretty
it
jamming.
it rocks. It gives like a lot of like really solid momentum for to go from that to another one of my favorite moments on the album, which is "We're in This Together," which kind of calls back to, again, there is a consistent theme of duality in all respects, but there is kind of a shadow other self that Trent will often reference within the lyricism here. There's always an other self, an other version of oneself that is fighting him every step of the way. And We're in This Together is very much about the parasitic slash symbiotic relationship that you have with this to your primal kind of more base impulses that's tied to. It's kind of just Trent being completely driven and strangled by his own id and his desire that like pulls him towards excess, pulls him towards drug use. It's like it's one of those songs that kind of feels like it literally does carry you along, kicking and screaming through itself.
Yeah, that's an interesting song because it is one of those. It's sort of like double meaning in the lyrics because it makes it sound like a kind of we're gonna persevere through something like this, but from that reading, it's like no, it is kind of a we will persevere into making ourselves worse, basically, which is very hilarious when you consider that this song was used for the trailer for the Avengers film as like a fuck
Are
yeah, hell yeah.
seriously?
Yes, I kid you not.
I did not know that at all.
It was the first Avengers. I think it was like one of the first trailers they used. We're in this
But
together now, and it's like, oh yeah, sick. It's like Unity or whatever. And I thought it was so sick as a child, but now looking back at it, I was like, wait a minute.
yeah, I was about to bring up that too. It's a corny trailer.
It is so corny. It's hilarious. I love it though.
The tonal dissonance there, oh boy, that must be something.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, there's another big trailer song on this album too, which is a few tracks ahead, which is just like you imagined, which was in the trailer for Zack Snyder's 300,
Yes.
which was probably my first exposure to anything from this album.
Yeah, actually,
Wow.
same here, probably.
Yeah.
You're telling me this for the first time. It's kind of difficult for me to imagine these songs within a different context because these are all such album songs. Like they have extended intros and outros that are meant to stitch the listening experience together. They are structurally often super askew and way more focused on being part of a greater whole rather than just moments in and of themselves. So like the idea of taking them out and listening to them in any other context is just kind of strange to me because it's so meant. I mean, it's like it would be like watching one particular scene out of a given film without the rest of the film around it, where it just kind of loses shape a little bit more. But I feel to some extent with the last two albums, they were way more like even albums or songs that weren't singles, you could like thrust forward as having single appeal, and they kind of worked as moments. And the Downward Spiral flirted with these kind of moments, but it was, only in pockets. I would say that the vast majority of that track list has more like definitive appeal, whereas here as we go along, like once we get towards the title track, this is just kind of where the album kind of outspools and just becomes very, very unorthodox, very, very unwieldy in its pacing.
It is a very like expansive sort of thing, and I feel like by all accounts I shouldn't like it in the way that it is structured. But I think it's also because I'm just such a fan of the ambient element of it, and that does make up such a large chunk of this thing that I don't know. I think even though I agree, it does kind of like spool out after a certain point because like the fragile and then a song that sort of connects it back with. Oh wait, no, I may be getting the layout of that wrong. I remember there's a song that uses like the same rhythm and kind of like sound as La Mer, but I think that's in the second volume. But there is this weird uniformity to it all that just it feels kind of more like Nine Inch Nails doing like opera, but like it's Nine Inch Nails, so it's not really opera. It's more so just it's expansive in its scale more than anything else.
You even see a wider kind of conglomerate of people coming in to sort of help Trent with this one behind the scenes. For example, we have a new drummer with the band, playing with the band in live shows and contributing parts to the album in Chris Verena, who was actually replaced by a guy named Bill Riflin. And then he was replaced by Jerome Dillon. So we have like already out the gate, we have three different voices contributing here. But Jerome Dillon actually did become, I believe, the full-time drummer of the band from here on out. But we also had people like Charlie Clouser and Danny Launer who contributed some instrumentation and compositions to a couple of tracks, even though Reznor is notably like the main writer of 90% of this. This was also mixed by Alan Moulder, once again, the kind of legendary 90s alternative music mixer. And like there was just a lot of people, including, of course, as we'll get to, like Dr. Dre, who were credited on the production end of things. So like there was a concerted effort on Trent's behalf as kind of a curator to make this an everything in the kitchen sink album. He was clearly pulling from everything, and whether or not that was a result of confidence, desperation, or complete excess on his part, probably a little bit of all three, if we're being perfectly honest. But it is these qualities that lead this to being, again, at concert with itself. But even then, like, I would argue that this album starts getting kind of bug nutty even before the first side of the LP ends. Like
Yeah.
even deeper, Pilgrimage and No You Don't, like this is some of the most abstract stuff that Nine Inch Nails have made up until this point. And putting it right next to each other, like again, it makes emotional sense to me, but like if you just sort of break it down as like a set of moments out of context, it's like, what about this is supposed to work or make sense?
Right. Uh, each time I listen to Pilgrimage, I actually get like new things to appreciate to that song, even though it's like a instrumentally and production wise pretty simple song. It just it's just like a kind of like a crooning tune,
It's
like
awesome.
you like the repeated drawing like da na 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 da
Hmm.
da da da, and then you're just picking up so many like interesting details about that kind of instrumentation that I think is really cool.
It's hugely like the layering, the amount of detail on here. This is the first Nine Inch Nails album that kind of feels like it was mixed to just be an auditory experience. It feels as though these mixes were carefully put together so that you can hear each kind of really tiny individual detail, every kind of bit of instrumentation. It feels really, really careful, really, really considered. In fact, I think it is one of the only aspects of this experience's design that is elegant kind of in any way, because it is mostly just sort of like, it's an album that feels like there is something wrong at its very core, but this one aspect of it feels very tailored, and it's kind of how you can go along with some of its more adventurous ideas, is that I kind of put myself in the hands of people who I assume know what they're doing.
I want to also highlight something about Pilgrimage, since we just kind of briefly mentioned that a little bit, that I think goes to what you're saying about just the auditory quality, because I think that song has like both ends of the spectrum of like extremity with like the quality of it, because you have I kind of mentioned a little bit like almost like the large crowd sounds and almost like an arena type kind of quality to it, but then it ends on what I was like would describe as like an oddly compressed circus sound that almost sounds like the MIDI file that they would use for a Bollywood film. It's very weirdly specific sounding. It was just like, but like the fact that like it
You're right. You're
begins and ends
right.
with those two things.
It has a really weird tenor that feels like it was plucked in and from maybe even a completely non-musical place, but it feels genuinely like an alien moment on this record.
Just a truly alienating, I guess, is kind of just one of those words that is always going to be present when you're talking about Nine Inch Nails. I think the difference between this and like other records is that it is at its most potent. It's like at the beginning you have like, as you're saying, something like something somewhat damaged. The deeper you progress into this thing, it is feels like anything that is any comfort of sound whenever it does show up is never going to stay as long as you think it does. Because like I think of like a track like La Mer as like this kind of moment of almost pure clarity, an almost
Mhm.
frightening amount of clarity, but that doesn't even last very long before it just delves deeply into like sonic haze that just surrounds your entire head like a fish tank.
The way I would describe that song is you're just kind of living through life, but then the sonic that kind of like sonic haze comes through, and it's kind of the world is on fast forward, but you're still on play.
Hmm.
And I was just like, oh, that's a really kind of fun mixture of sounds there. It's a song I like to listen to when I'm on the train too, because it's a fun and like a city song, like industrial city song, just to like jam while you're walking through the city, I guess.
Yeah.
And a weirdly
Music to dissociate to.
and it weirdly gives me like this industrial prime time or prestige television opening sequence vibe,
Yeah.
like how Mad Men uses RJD2 as a beautiful mind to its kind of. I
A
know that
montage of in the show The Bear could be set to this song.
or
I
like
was
The
literally gonna
Wire.
say that. Oh my God.
Or like The Wire or something.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
I completely see. It's a song that evokes spaces.
in a weird way. I think a lot of the music on here could be described that way. And again, like it's kind of why I have such trouble voicing. It's because it's a very esoteric album, but it also is very like it's best described in synesthetic terms. The only album, like curiously enough, the album I would most closely compare to this in mood and just sort of like some of the sounds and spaces it explores is Death Consciousness by Have a Nice Life. Probably the only double album I
Interesting.
like more than this, but it's sort of an album that really is great at simulating spaces, but that album is more about kind of really sort of wide expanses. It's about emptiness. Whereas I would describe The Fragile as being about claustrophobia. It's about like grinding you against these sort of really kind of squelching and sharp sounds, and then kind of letting you pool yourself in the wider expanse of it and just being like choking you, letting you breathe, choking you, letting you breathe. It's what gives it a kind of rhythm, and it's what makes like going from La Mer to The Great Below to The Only Way Out Is Through feel like it does at least make sense on that like one primal level.
And also something to say, because you also mentioned this earlier on, but the song that did get me to listen to this album was also La Mer. So I guess we could have both of that go in there too. But I also agree with you because it's like I kind of mentioned like the sort of almost opera quality of it. And I think that kind of sort of lends itself to that, where it's this closing tension that keeps sort of having moments of release. There is some moments of catharsis in there, but it is also not, this is Nine Inch Nails. We're not here for catharsis. We're here to get deep into that shit and not come out.
And that's
Right.
kind of what The Great Below is sort of like. It's Trent sort of going up to a precipice and being like, I'm here now. What happens next? And then we kind of plunge deeper into, I guess, like the best analogy I can put is that the second half of this album is like plunging deeper into psychosis. And we start with The Only Way Out Is Through, Into the Void, and Where Is Everybody, which this sort of three-track sequence really sort of it's a good litmus test for what the remainder of this experience is going to be like, and how the first part of this record felt like still interlocking and tightly knit, even if it was sort of oscillating between two very different extremes, whereas this is just fucking kooky. Like there
Yeah.
is barely structure here at all. You are kind of just being whipped around from idea to idea. And I can understand why that would view some people to sort of see that this is kind of an inelegant sort of section of music. And I think it undeniably is. But I'm just sort of at the point with this album where I'm so in the tank for it that I would argue that it really adds something to the experience. There is something that comes to like Trent sort of building his acumen over the course of this decade and it culminating in this thing that is just, it is showing every possible like aspect of what Nine Inch Nails' sound could be like in ways that are completely beyond the pale. That people who are trying to curate an experience, from into an album that is full of thought that people want to consume, like Trent does not give a fuck. This is something that is made purely for the sake of it, something that is super duper indulgent. And in that uniqueness, to me, it at least finds a kind of singularity that, don't get me wrong, I'm a fan of a lot of Nine Inch Nails albums that come after this. I think we will make an argument that a lot of them are deeply, deeply underrated when we actually get to talking about them. But this aspect of like that there being a sort of unkemptness to the sound and the structure, that doesn't happen again for this band. This is kind of the last time we see Trent really pushing himself to do something different and expand what Nine Inch Nails as a band, as a project even is. And I appreciate it for that because Trent's a guy who really prides himself on a kind of having a strict idea of what a Nine Inch Nails album is from here on out. So it does feel like the last gasp of true experimentation on this band's behalf.
Adding on to that, it was such a big swing, especially considering the it's following up downward spiral.
Mhm.
Like this came out in 99, correct?
Yep,
Yeah,
99.
and it just kind of like listening to this and it kind of like a whole different beast because you could say like the first half of this album is kind of like Downward Spiral, but the second half very much is not, except for like one song in my opinion, but we'll get to that one. And so to add to that unkeptness that we don't really get to that, I think Trent's experience on for the production of this album and also the tour
Yep.
maybe got him like a double-edged sword lesson in that kind of what that kind of ambition brings to himself, and maybe if he has aspirations to really straddle that kind of big swing again, because it's been quite a bit since his album's been released now, and he just turned 60 in my if I'm not
Good
mistaken.
God.
Yeah,
I
and
believe so.
Wow.
and he's a much different person now, so we're never really going to get an album like this again, even from Trent Reznor, even though I think he's putting out some of the best stuff of his career in the music score scene. But this is very much an album of its time, and I think that's a very good thing because I lightning in a bottle.
The Fragile is not an album that you finish. It is an album you survive, not just when listening to it, but when making it. I
Right.
mean, like, very literally, for those who don't know, it was on the Fragile 2.0 tour where Trent actually did end up overdosing on heroin, which I believe is cited as the kind of moment that caused him to sort of cut everything and get clean for the production of the next record. But like this sort of moment here is just like it's just kind of one of those. I think lightning in the bottle is the best way you could possibly put it, is that this is an album that could have been only made at this exact point, and we are lucky that Trent was able, because like, there is a very, very kind of, we talked about this in the last episode, in fact, that there was a, dark future where that was the last Nine Inch Nails album. I think that there is a far more likely timeline where this is the last Nine Inch Nails album, because again, it is purely about a lack of discipline when putting things together. It is the kind of ideal of what we call here on the channel the double album masterpiece. I would say that like The Fragile and like Melancholy and The Infinite Sadness are like albums that are very much at peace with each other as being like it's just a grab bag of ideas. It's not necessarily about cohesion. It's not necessarily about like being conceptual. It's about being visceral and trying to kind of make that purely that aspect. That's what like guides the pace of the experience. And you have to do like insane swings to be able to pull that off and make it work. Like again, Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness, I think, is a great example of that. It's just like there's no limit to that album sound. Like there is not a conceivable idea where you can be like, oh yeah, that's an idea that Billy Corgan wouldn't have put on here. Like, no, he put every idea that came into his stupid little head on that album, and no matter how cringeworthy or strange it's aged, it's based and it rocks. This album is kind of a similar space because there are similar kind of like teenage angsty lyrical ideas on here, but it just kind of serves to add more to the experience of there being a kind of pathetic, angsty, juvenile voice at the center of it that is voicing these complaints and with the world around him, like in a lot of very kind of explicitly anti-corporate sentiment, more so than it's ever been on a Nine Inch Nails album specifically. We kind of shift in how like what we're critiquing in terms of like the last album being a little bit more geared to consumerism specifically and like anti-religious aspect, and that's occasionally on here, but I would argue that he's kind of shifted perspectives a bit sociologically speaking. But just because these concerns on here are expressed in an occasionally juvenile way doesn't exactly invalidate them being there at all, is what I would argue against the pitchfork writers of the world who had the astounding critical ability to be able to judge that, oh, some of the lyrical sentiments on here are they're kind of childish. And it's just like, yeah, because the person writing them is, being blasted in half by heroin on a nightly fucking basis and feels some type of way about it and isn't exactly super elegant at expressing himself at this point, as addicts in the midst of addiction often are. And it shows a failure to kind of read the room, I guess, when you take a look at some of the critical pushback of the Fragile. I think that, like, I get it in spirit, but the idea of being on board with an album like The Downward Spiral and not being on board with the Fragile doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me personally.
I think it also should be noted the same guy who reviewed the Fragile for Pitchfork also wrote the Kid A review for Pitchfork. I just realized that too. So, and in a ways, Kid A and the Fragile, in my opinion, have some very similar qualities to it. In my opinion.
I'd
I
agree to
would
that actually, yeah.
argue, in fact, Kid A is not a double album, but I think that there is a similar split of like more immediate, hard-hitting, single-esque moments on the front half of Kid A, whereas the jazzier experimentation of the second half with those like, more IDM inspired tracks, even like that dichotomy is 100% here. Like, I mean, Into the Void, Where Is Everybody? The Mark Has Been Made. It's almost disingenuous to call them songs. It's like these are moments that occur in a stream of consciousness that has now begun spinning itself outwardly.
Yeah, and I was gonna say I might have to agree with you about like the juvenile sentiment of this album because I think it's one of those like I mean it's sort of there in all of previous Nine Inch Nails albums in some semblance of a way, but it's like there's probably it's a bit more clever, maybe a bit more purposeful, whereas here it's a little more at you about it. But like I think the reason why it works well to me is like I kind of think of it in the way of to use films as analogies. There's a lot of teen movies that we watch that were like this sucks and it's awful and like most of them are maybe not the best, but there's always like one that is the one that feels the most honest and is like your favorite thing. And this is kind of what it feels like with like Nine Inch Nails, where it's like there's a lot of emo music and sort of very sort of angsty sort of writing and styles that when it doesn't work, it is, it can always just feel like it falls completely flat because it feels like it's disingenuous. Even slightly honest, it kind of hits harder than most things usually do. And also to comment on the Pitchfork review, I didn't know they made letterbox reviews in 1999. But
It's
anyways,
alarming. Like, if you haven't read that Nine Inch Nails review, I almost recommend it because even reading an out of context paragraph of it, like, I read the most lucid part of that review, which is like this timeline of recollected events. The idea of somebody writing that and in like breathlessly calling an artist pretentious in like the next breath is hysterical to me because like dude, I need a strategy guide to understand your critique here, and you're saying that Trent Reznor is a useless writer. Okay, cool, man,
I,
whatever.
I
But
yeah, yeah.
I also think it's kind of like ignoring all like how sincere of an album this is.
oh,
Like it is
100%.
a dearly sincere record without really a hint of irony, I would say, which I can't really say about most records produced in this time because you like this is obviously a time where Radiohead was kind of making big rounds also, but they're kind of a lot of their songwriting and lyricism is very heavily irony poised. So it's just kind of like not to bring up them up again. I'm just kind of like using them as kind of a reference point. It kind of is an underappreciated aspect about the lyricism and songwriting for this album is just how much of Trent's heart he is putting on this on the table, more than Downward Spiral, which is also very a pretty sincere album about being just so angry and horny all the time.
It's all to do with, I think we talked about the sort of disparate polarities of this album. It's about extremes, and Trent doesn't undershoot anything. He does go explicitly for those extremes. And because they are sincerely expressed, I completely agree with the writing on here that just because it can occasionally, teeter into more juvenile stuff, it's a lot easier to take seriously. Again, we keep going back to Manson as kind of a creative partner. That's kind of why I think some of his stuff hasn't aged nearly as well as a lot of this, is that it's like all irony. It's like all of it is very informed by this sort of contradictory sort of like, it's just like that was Manson's form of antagonism. Whereas this is like every bit of it is so aimed internally. It is an album that, like, just because it is about extremes, it is also about being helpless, and the response to being helpless being anger because you don't understand anything. And I kind of feel like that's what the first half of the album cogently explains. And that's sort of what, again, like the second half of the album is in just how it's more based around vibes. It's a little bit more intuitive in how the music makes you feel. It's less informed by the lyrics, and the lyrics serve as more flavor text for just showing you how the central character being written about in all of these songs responds to the stimuli of the music, which I think gives this part of the album a really, like, there is a super immediate kind of immersive quality about the depth of the sound on songs like The Mark Has Been Made or Please, for instance.
I will say something though. I agree almost completely with what all y'all are saying about how this really has no irony to it. I will say there is one song that does
Yeah,
have
I,
a
I
bit of it.
I was about to say, aside from one song,
Yeah.
I feel, are we thinking about the same one, Starfuckers?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
That, which is the biggest song on the second half of this album for sure. Rumored diss track towards Marilyn Manson, though they did
I,
actually make up after
Uh,
this by
I,
performing on a song together.
yeah.
So
I was also under impression this is also about Courtney Love, but uh,
yeah, that was another one as well. I mean, we kind of mentioned Cobain earlier, is something that was clearly on Trent Reznor's mind to
mhm.
some extent, and we will forgive him a little bit for directing his anger at some perhaps undue subjects in
Yeah.
that instance.
Uh, I just know him and Courtney Love really did not get along in the 90s, but they
I don't think anyone has gotten along with Courtney Love in a very, very long time.
that's
I will
very
afford her a
fair.
bit of grace for that decade, but after that, less so. Just as, like, we kind of built off of this a second ago, but I would like to say that the most notorious song on the second half of this record is Starfuckers Incorporated, which is a little bit controversial these days, both because of it supposedly being about a couple of people and the title of it getting changed after a certain amount of time, where it's basically censored. And I believe performed, like, for a while it was not called the Fuckers was dropped. So it was a whole thing. I would just like to say I don't care about any of that shit because this song fucking slams. I don't care. I don't care what you think, brother. This shit tears ass. And it happens at a perfect moment on the second half of this where it's like you kind of need a cogent moment to anchor you back into this experience. And right after the song Please, I feel like it hits you as exactly as hard as something needs to at this point.
Oh yeah. Especially like I don't know if you've ever heard of the live cut from And All That Could Have Been.
mm,
Yes,
Um
yes.
yes.
that
Yes.
the The energy and that like live recording of that album is so
Crazy.
untouched by almost any other thing that they've done. It's fist pumpingly good. It gets fire in in your veins.
That song, one thing I will point out specifically because it's the like ear equivalent of like massaging my brain is like the little kind of sort of stuttering glitch effect that they do for Trent Reznor's vocals in the beginning when he's like,
Yep.
"My God," then that sort of bit. I fucking love that effect that they do on that. And then yeah, like the rest of this is kind of I call this sort of like a Dragula type in that it's a song that you could see a bunch of people in a car just like shaking it to.
It's definitely got goth club written all over it for sure. Like it conceivably, if it's not on the soundtrack to The Matrix, it could be. Or Dark City, as the Pitchfork review mentioned. So there you go. Completely in line with that. I love how they say that as though that's supposed to denigrate the movie, where I'm just like, I don't know, bro. I fucking love Dark City, so that sounds really cool
All
to
right.
me. Like, I don't know, man. I think when you watch cool things and then put them in your music as a kind of tribute, I think it's based and awesome.
It's it's
Yeah.
Uh,
that it's that meme that's like this thing is totally lame and it's coolest thing ever in the
and it's the coolest
background.
thing ever. 100,
I
100%.
I also think should be important to note that this album was also released after Trent's or Nine Inch Nails' first venture into soundtrack making, where they made the soundtrack for the video game Quake, which I think
Yep.
still has carried fingerprints from that soundtrack over to this, because this is like a fun as fuck album to play Quake or Doom to.
No, you're totally, totally correct. You can hear how like some of the rhythms just have a little bit more insistence. Like the BPM of this album, it oscillates a lot, which is probably why a lot of people necessarily wouldn't associate that idea with this album. But like in its higher energy moments, like this thing is fucking like, yeah, it's Nine Inch Nails. It's aggressive music, but like some of this shit is seriously, legitimately, really propulsive.
Yeah.
And I think it kind of, again, it kind of needs to be, again, to fulfill that sort of extreme quota. And I mean, there's nothing more extreme than after Starfuckers, we kind of have the rest of the album just kind of becomes maximum head scratching of the run of Complication through Ripe with Decay, which is, it's kind of like this is a miniature speed run of what the entire album feels like to listen to, but in a series of like an EP's worth of songs.
Yeah, I mean, one of the last song titles is basically what I would refer to these last
The
five
big
the
come
big come
down.
down. It's like you're speed running a come down from psychedelics, and
Yeah,
you're
yeah.
just like, what the hell is going on here? But it happens in like in 20 minutes,
It's
and
all
it's
about presenting it gives you a thread to dangle by, and just that. It feels like the final challenge of the album listening experience.
Yeah, very abrasive, especially in that song, and especially like in the last song, "Ripe with Decay," which doesn't really sound like a kind of any really other song on the record before it. It does sound like, it's kind of like a perfect metaphor for the album. It's kind of like this fruit that's fresh from the vine, but it's eaten, but the bugs have already gotten to it.
100%. It does feel like the album is continually sort of, it is sort of intentionally kind of goading the listener with the challenge of just being able to sit down and consume this album in one sustained listen. But it is very good at like, it presents little synecdoches of itself so that you have like a specific sort of sonic narrative to latch onto. I'm never quite, I don't feel like lost in this album, maybe like I used to when I first heard the record. The more you listen to it, the more everything feels like it makes sense. You feel the design, the sort of architecture of the experience, the more you acquaint yourself with it. And I don't know, I find that aspect of it incredibly rewarding. It's why, like, again, we don't need to compare two beautiful women all the time, but I do think that this edges out over the Downward Spiral for me personally, just because I find the totality of it more engaging and like a bit more emotionally like it's an easier pill to swallow than the Downward Spiral is. Like it's not a pleasant or like super, it's not super feel good awesome. Again, this is the Ocean of Heroin album, but it is designed in such a way that it feels like you can compartmentalize it much easier. It's less like soul sucking than the Downward Spiral can be, which like yeah, it has its moments, but that is not an album I am always in the mood to listen to. Whereas this is less a question of mood and more a question of patience.
My kind of line of thought is like I think I find those two albums very difficult to listen to, especially like saying if I can't decide if which one is more digestible to me personally because I can totally see like this being like easily more digestible than Downward Spiral, but to me like this is a behemoth. Like
Oh yeah.
this is an almost an hour of 40 minutes of just Trent Reznor just hashing it out. And I guess with the Downward Spiral, to me, it just feels a little more focused,
Oh, for
but
sure.
not saying that's a good or really bad thing either in terms of this album. Especially, I think Downward Spiral has a lot more different sounds that co- uh this album really wants to mature from. Like you weren't gonna find anything like Heresy on this album.
No, definitely
Um,
not.
which is one of my favorites from Downward Spiral, in my
Ditto.
opinion. So they're two very big different beasts. Depends on which day you really ask me. I would give you either which one. I would give you either or answer on which album I prefer.
And we clowned on the Pitchfork review, and rightfully so, but at the same time, this is not an album I would begrudge anyone for being like, yeah, man, it's a bit all over the place, or it kind of loses focus. Like, it's completely understandable, and to some extent, it's why it's like, yeah, this is seen as a classic in hindsight, and it was received well at the time, but the kind of crack in the dam that did happen with the perception of this band, like, yeah, I can understand why this may have lost a swath of fans just at the time, just because it's a big ask. It's very and it's just a very different kind of record than the two that came before it. So like this being a point at which like a lot of people dropped off with the band is kind of inevitable. We can make fun of them for being lame losers who don't get to partake in one of the coolest and most awesomest albums ever, but
Real.
still if anything it is proof that Trent succeeded in his goals because he didn't compromise. Nothing on this album feels like a half measure. It feels like nothing but I am going to commit to being as far reaching, as all encompassing as I possibly can. And again, the older I get, the more the everything in the kitchen sink approach from talented artists that some more often than not will end up being my favorite moment from them because you get to see them at their most maximal. It's why like my favorite double albums are this Death Consciousness, Julia Holter's Aviary. Like I like when people are just like, fuck it. I don't care if people even like this. I'm just gonna shoot for the moon. And occasionally, sometimes you do actually end up hitting the moon.
I was gonna say it's like I think you put that very beautifully, and I think that gets me to realize why this probably is my favorite because I think like not all the time the kitchen sink approach works for me because I think there are some times where like for some artists it can be just too expansive of a thing, but like for comparison, I think something that's like its own kind of like this is literally just the kitchen sink thing that I'm experiencing right now is the last Dark Tower book, which is like
Oh, very, very much a kitchen sink book series of books there at the end.
yes, and it's like I think the reason why like when a kitchen sink approach works is that it kind of feels like anything is kind of possible. Like, it's sort of like it feels like its own little microcosm of a world that exists,
Well,
which in the case of
it
Nine Inch
proves its
Nails,
own singularity, like
yeah,
only Trent Reznor could have made The Fragile. Like
exactly.
nobody else who has ever lived would ever make an album like this. And that's why these projects I think are so alluring to people like us, is that it's like if any tiny piece of the circumstances that allowed the creation of this album were shifted to the left, it could be an entirely different experience. But this is so singular, so in the moment, so of its time, but not like dated of its time. Because again, you go back and even listen to the Downward Spiral, and it's like none of that album's sound has aged. Like Pretty Hate Machine had moments where it was like, no, this feels like an album that's coming out at the end of the 1980s. Like it definitely sounds like that. Whereas these two records, aged immaculately. I would you would hear the sounds off of this, and it's like it sounds expertly recorded. That's the only like notable thing about the production of this record that I feel like I can say is that you can tell that this is the point at which Trent is going to be known for a specific style of soundtrack that sort of mimics that level of crystalline polish within a recording.
Yes, very much so. It's just kind of a like very just despite the indulgence, it's pristine, which is kind of what I think is like the best of art. It kind of has to be both of those things, I think, sometimes. And I just think it is so beautifully done. And I think the reason why for me, like, because like the Downward Spiral has so much more of a cohesion to it, and it's much more like stable, and it's like I get why that's like so many people's favorites. But I think the reason why I love something like this is like the best example I can think of is with the final song, right? There's these strings at the beginning that remind me a lot of Hurt, which, is
Yeah.
like my favorite song from Downward Spiral. But the thing is, there is like there are no vocals. There is an absence that is very like powerful, which is I think indicative of the thing I kind of love about Nine Inch Nails because I love their explosive tracks, but the thing I love more is the music that they do where you are more aware of absence as much as the sounds itself. Like, you think of like a classic Trent Reznor piano piece that's just like dun 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 stuff like that, where it's like you are aware of the notes, but it's just like the space between is what's powerful. And I think this is the album that really hits that for me more than any other.
100%.
Mhm.
This is one of my favorites ever of all time. It is a hard 10 from yours truly. Second Nine Inch Nails album I can say that about. And yeah, it's very heavy.
Oh yeah.
I'm jealous of you because I was in Chicago last week and I saw that album and I was like, I might buy that, but I didn't, and now I regret it.
It does sound exceptionally good on wax. So next time on the Nine Inch Nails retrospective, we are going to be covering the next album in this discography, which is With Teeth, which comes after a bit of a culmination point for Trent Reznor. We kind of mentioned that there was an overdose in his future after The Fragile, and that is going to inform a lot of the changes that Trent makes both to himself and to their sound going forward. And I believe we are going to be joined by Zach for that episode. He is a big, big fan of With Teeth. So look forward to that in the future. Trevor, thank you for joining us today and talking about this excellent, unwieldy, incredible record. And yeah,
Thank you for having me. Yeah, it's a doozy to really dissect and discuss.
she's a biggin, but you know what? She's worth it. I wouldn't want her any other way. A beautiful queen
Big
With
queen.
with a
three
thick
C's.
ass boy.